Hi everybody, welcome to the third session of the Arctic Summer College. Today Brendan, will be moderating the conversation. We've got an exciting pair of presentations today from Pamela Lesser and Dr. Sonja Bickford. We'll get to their presentations in a minute, and while we get a few more people signed on. We've got most of us already here. But while we're preparing, I wanted to go over a few housekeeping issues. Most important from my perspective, of course, today is the final day to submit your abstracts for consideration to attend the Arctic Circle Assembly. What we're looking for in these abstracts is not, I've been communicating with some of you, corresponding with some of you, we're not looking for specifically a print-ready abstract, but what we're looking for is a research-ready idea, a very clearly stated research question or thesis, a sense of the methodology that you want to employ to try to answer that question, and then why this question or why that answer in particular is important to the broader research concerning the Arctic or Arctic governance or Arctic policies. So we have a few abstracts so far. I've been communicating, as I said, with some of you to kind of edit and develop some of these ideas. They're all very good. They're all quite exciting. So I do look forward to hopefully getting even more submissions so that we can really make sure to have a great contingent in October. Just a reminder, it doesn't cost you a penny. We'll pay for the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung is paying for our flights and our hotel accommodations, and we have received a grant to waive the registration fees, so there will be no cost to you, and it's from August 13th through the 15th, or October 13th through the 15th, sorry about that. And it's a lot of fun. It'll be an exciting event. Anybody who studies the Arctic knows that the Arctic Circle Assembly is quite the affair. Yeah, secondarily, I wanted to let you know if you do miss any of the webinars, any of our sessions, they are put on our YouTube channel pretty quickly afterwards. So you can always check there. Also, if you want to relive the experience or check back on something, obviously, because it's the YouTube channel, some of the presentations will be, or all of the presentations you'll be able to see. We will talk with our presenters about making their presentations available to us as well, either in PDF or PowerPoint format, in case you want to have them for reference materials for either further research that you're doing or just to remember something that we've talked about. Also, there's, of course, the Facebook page. It is a closed group, so you do have to request to be added. There's a little bit of a backlog during the holidays, but I believe everybody so far who's requested has been granted access, and please use that. That's a good opportunity for you to connect with more people who have participated in the past, either as participants, as fellows, or as instructors. And it's a good place to ask questions, see what's out there, and connect with other people who are working in the field. And then, of course, we have the Arctic Summer College website. And one thing I wanted to mention about that, I don't know if anybody's talked about it to this point, we have actually a blog function on that website. I might be outing myself a little bit here. I'm a bit of a writer, and so I'll probably talk mostly about the writing opportunities associated with the Arctic Summer College. But the blog is another area in which, if you're interested, you're welcome to submit to us a blog post based on the topics that we're covering, either from the past sessions or upcoming sessions, or other topics that are contemporary, that are happening in the news, perhaps, at the moment. So if you think of anything, if there's any idea that sparks, or anything that sparks an idea, feel free just to submit a proposal, and all I mean is 2-3 sentences saying I'd like to write a blog post about this topic. You can submit it, ideally with visual aids, of course, but I'll help you with that. I'll help you with the with that development, the editing process, and we'll get it up pretty quickly. Blog posts, 400 to 600 words generally, just sort of general approach to a topic, no real deep research necessary. It's just a way to get a conversation going. So that's another opportunity. And if you want to get some writing practice, writing credits in, and once again with the papers, like I said, the abstracts are due today, but we will be publishing yet again a yearbook from this year's class, and so there's more to this paper writing business than just going to Reykjavik. We would like everybody to submit a paper, an article, a chapter that would then go into this year's yearbook, because I think there's so many different areas that are being worked on, and I think it could make a valuable contribution to the literature that's out there. So with all of that, I guess I've talked a bit much, but I wanted to make sure this is my first time leading the conversation, leading the session this year, so I wanted to make sure you all kind of got an idea of what I'm here for. Those of you who have been submitting abstracts or asking questions about them may have had a few clues already, but I tend to be the writing person. So any questions along those lines, please feel free to reach out at any point. I'm always accessible under that coordinator at arcticsummercollege.org address. With all of that said, I think it's time to move on to our presentations today. It's quite exciting. This is a very different topic in a sense than what we've been looking at in the last couple of weeks. But this week we have two presenters who have worked with each other and have actually spent time at the same institute in Rovaniemi, Finland. It's Pamela Lesser, who is currently working as a researcher at the Arctic Center at the University of Lapland in Finland, and also Dr. Sonja Bickford, who did some postdoctoral work, I believe, at that Arctic Center, and who is now at the University of Nebraska in, my Irish roots might come out here, but in Kearney, might be Kearney, I always assume the worst. But anyway, the two of them will be talking today on environmental impact assessments. And what's interesting, what I really like about some of the background work here is that Dr. Bickford, for example, has a business background, and she has an MBA, I believe, but has worked a lot with economics. And this, I think, is part of the assessment area that I know we at Ecologic work on, but a lot of the work that we've been doing, especially at the Washington office, has been a little more focused on environmental impacts and maybe not enough on how this, what the implications are for businesses and corporations. So it should be an interesting discussion. We will start with Dr. Bickford. If you have questions, I just want to point out what we'll do today is, because the two presentations work so well together, I'd like to do the two presentations back to back. And since both of our presenters have offered to stay with us during the entire session, we'll then have a larger conversation following Pamela's presentation. If you have questions, I highly recommend either writing them in the questions field or under the chat function. to write them down if you're worried about remembering them. And then I can call back on you and unmute you so you can participate in the conversation at the very end. If there's anything, otherwise, of course, once we start the conversation and discussion period at the end, you can also just raise your hand. I think there's a little button you can click to let me know, and I'll acknowledge you that way. So first, as I said, we'll start with Dr. Bickford. If you want to make yourself, we can hear you, perfect. And I'll make you the presenter now so you can share your screen and your slides with everybody. Without further ado.
All right. There you go. Can we see the slides on your end?
Yes, yes we do.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'll go ahead and start. Thank you for the wonderful intro, Brendan. Again, my name's Sonja Bickford, and I'm currently at the University of Nebraska in Kearney with the Department of Communication. However, my academic background, as you mentioned, I do have an MBA and then a doctorate in global business and leadership. So coming from the business side, however, I did, as you mentioned, do my postdoc at the Arctic Center and got to work with Pamela Lesser as well as our team from Finland and even Russia in terms of this project that I want to talk to you and present to you on today. As far as my Arctic research, I am actually originally from Finland, so my roots are in the Arctic. But the research essentially started during my time at the Arctic Center and has since continued not only in environmental impact assessments, looking at the best practices, but also into corporate social responsibility, which in itself is very multidisciplinary, as well as even in ecotourism. In terms of this first in Arctic EIA project that you're seeing the initial slide for, the project was a 2-year project funded by the Finnish Funding Agency for Technology from 2013 to 2015, during which time we assessed the EIA best practices, not only the process, but also those that went above and beyond within the process as examples. And the 2 examples that I'll talk about today are Sweden and the US. The aim of the overall project was to strengthen Finland's knowledge and know-how about the environmental impact assessments and establish themselves even more so as an expert in the field, and that is within the Northern Institute of Environmental and Minority Law at the Arctic Center. Oh, there we go. In terms of the project, what we set out to do within these 2 years, the 3 things we had in mind at the beginning that we wanted to have as deliverables were, first of all, the examples of the best practices. Those we set out to gather during benchmarking visits, which I'll talk to you about here in a little bit, as well as a roadmap, not only assessing what is going on now, but what are some of the wish list items for the future? Where do we see this project going and growing? Are there other areas of interest, not only to public decision makers, but also what about the private sector? And then what made this project unique was also its focus on helping Finnish companies and their market entry barrier essentially into northwestern Russia. And so part of the project in the benchmarking and information gathering was to provide an online free information service on environmental impact assessments for companies wanting to enter into Russia. So in terms of the environmental impact assessment process itself, it is a legal process set forth within the code, directive, or act. For example, it initiated in the US as the NEPA, or the National Environmental Protection Act, signed into the act or law in 1970. It essentially guides the process for decision making on environmental impact assessments has since moved to social impacts and environmental impacts, or economic impacts, but those may or may not be required depending on the country. So in terms of the process that we undertook during this 2-year process, understanding how the environmental code or act or directive is set in place in terms of that process within the national countries, and then what are some of the trends within those countries or even the regions or the Arctic as a whole. We conducted benchmarking visits to 7 countries, so all 8 Arctic countries were covered. And then during the 2-year process, we also engaged with our local stakeholder group. The stakeholder or steering committee, as we call them, were gathered together of local private sector as well as public sector and even NGO representatives that could give feedback real time in terms of the questions, issues, and applicability of the project's result. And those were covered in the roundtable and reflection spaces. This helped us provide that review of the best practices and get feedback from those stakeholders in terms of, are there further questions? Can we clarify something else? And then what information is needed for that online EIA in Russia and what is of interest. So that became essentially a side deliverable throughout the whole project itself. So what is the significance? NBV, the benchmarking visits, is what it's short for. Looking at the Arctic regions, what is there? What is happening? The economic development and the interest in the Arctic, as we know, is very driven by not only Arctic countries, but others from outside, and has increased, and the rate of development has increased in the last few decades. Currently, we see mines, the engineering firms, environmental consultants, as well as energy, tourism, as those companies operating in the Arctic, in addition to local and traditional groups with those traditional economic development opportunities. Where this comes together is that legal process of the environmental impact assessment and understanding how do we follow this process, but what are some best practices, what worked well, how do we work together, or in these cases, in terms of best practices, go above and beyond those legal requirements. So the wish list from the steering committee that I was talking about were, in terms of the countries to visit, the location choices, comparison of processes within the country so that we understand how these directives or acts are set in place and who oversees them, and how much consultation is done with the companies or community within that project. And then looking at specifically examples from other industries within their same sector or field. So the countries that were chosen, as I mentioned, were all the Arctic 8, essentially. Finland is not included, but we conducted interviews or benchmarking visits there as well. So what did we ask? I want to highlight a few questions within various areas of the EIA process that we asked during our benchmarking visits, during which we visited, again, representatives from both private and public sectors, as well as NGOs within each country and then region that we had chosen to benchmark. So for example, in visiting Alaska, looking at how understandable is the legislation itself, who drives that process, and are there some positive aspects of the system, or the things that work really well. The cooperation, looking at collaboration between the sectors, whether it's the government on the public side or the private sector or even NGOs. Are each individual or representative of those sectors knowledgeable about the other? And then looking at their various roles. In terms of roles and responsibilities, who else is involved in the process? Oftentimes we find that environmental impact assessment or environmental consultants have a role in preparing documents, or even the EIA study itself. Well, in that case, who provides the data? Is it the developer? Is it the consultant? Or is it the authority or somebody else? Or maybe even a combination thereof. And then, depending on who prepares it, who is actually responsible for the content within the documents. The tools and methodologies used to prepare an environmental impact assessment baseline data. Is there something we can compare to? Looking at the environmental impacts, or are social impacts required to be addressed, or are they addressed in a separate document, or are those voluntary practices? And then looking at stakeholder engagement and communication. Is there a requirement, or is that something or an area that works well voluntarily? Improvements. We sought advice on improvement suggestions to that process or the practices that were conducted within each Arctic country. And then, of course, the best practices. If we could find examples of what worked well. What are things that they might have seen or heard from in other countries or areas that worked well within that EIA process? For example, oftentimes in Finland we heard, well, things work great in Sweden. Why is that? Or is that true? And that was one of the things that we wanted to find out. And then looking at Arctic EIA. Wanted to ask whether there were differences, or the representatives felt that there were differences between southern and northern parts of the country, if that was the case, or various sections of the country, for example, in Iceland. And then in terms of Arctic, are there distinct regions, or should we call it something else, or do they feel like it's something else as far as their region, community, or position within the public or private sector? In terms of creating the network of these interviews and the benchmarks, wanted to show you a few examples of organizations, and this is, in this case, Finland. So we see the environmental consultants, the energy, tourism, as well as other industries that were represented. In terms of internationally, just want to quickly show you a few examples. So we see Iceland, Greenland, Sweden, Norway, Canada, and the US popped in there as well, and then Russia. So we see the variety and yet the similarity of the representatives of these industries. In terms of the best practices, what are some examples? So let's talk about Sweden first. In Sweden, we benchmarked the Luleå and Piteå region in fall of 2013. And just a quick overview. Sweden, of course, falls under the EU directive. In terms of Swedish, they fall under the Miljöbalken and the Planning and Building Act. You can see the process. One of the distinct things for Sweden is the little and large EIA. Also, you can see in this slide the public consultation periods and where those are required. So, for example, in Sweden, we see that it's fairly early on in the process. In terms of just some examples and things that we found fascinating, the concept of, and this is the first one on this slide, the principle of knowledge, meaning we all can read the environmental code, it's in writing. However, how we interpret that and implement that is then left to the applicants. There is no checklist to say you must do this, but it falls always on this principle of knowledge that you must know. Another example, as I mentioned previously, was this early public consultation. Oftentimes that's even done before, or the developers have extra meetings. So companies or developers are taking initiative on that front end and really collecting data, meeting with the public, and gathering some of those impacts and suggestions in terms of what their proposed development would be. Another interesting example is the reindeer herding analysis. Completely voluntary, but it's seen as a relationship building within that local traditional economic development or operation of reindeer herding, and then the current development coming in. So looking at just within that EIA process in Sweden, in terms of the control and follow-up, another interesting point and makes the Swedes different here is the self-reporting of EIA criteria. It's done on an annual basis, but companies or developers will hold even meetings when those may not be required to gather and update their stakeholders. In terms of the United States, and as I mentioned, we benchmarked Alaska, and that was actually done twice during the project so that we could have a better data set. So the cities we visited in Alaska were Anchorage, Fairbanks, and Barrow. And those were done in both 2013 and 2015. In terms of the US, we fall under the NEPA system. This is the federal system for EIA. And again, we see the process flow in this chart. And again, the public consultation periods or requirements within this. In the US, it's often referred to as the EIS as well. So looking at just some examples, the developer or project proposal may choose to complete a NEPA style document on their own, even though it's a lead agency that is chosen in the US to create that official document. But that way there's additional data and the developer or company has that additional resource that's used for the decision making. Another example, especially in Alaska and the Arctic, are these conflict avoidance agreements. They're not mandatory, but if signed, they can be legally binding and are then enforced by the National Marine Fisheries Services. And here's an example on this slide in terms of oil and gas in the agreement with the Whaling's Captain Association. Looking at stakeholder engagement, many have found across the Arctic that additional stakeholder consultation is needed. However, in those areas where development is very rapid and popular, we find that the stakeholder meeting fatigue kind of sets in. So the extra meetings, and then looking at engagement within the site or local community where the developer may spend extra time, money, or building that relationships with hiring local people for even during the EIA process. So looking at what else is done during this process, and especially in those areas with subsistence hunting and lifestyles, there may be times where meetings or visits may get postponed due to schedules. And then looking at that transparency within the communication. And another interesting finding was that climate change is now taking part as a consideration in the EIS applications. And oftentimes we are seeing that's becoming a standard, not necessarily a requirement, but it's expected to be there. And then looking at the additional documentation provided, the amount of information in EISs has grown quite a bit. The implementation and monitoring, looking at the company setting the requirements, the permits, and those are all listed in the EIS. That is all I had on my end. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Sonja. I did want to ask one question that came up. David, one of our participants, wrote in there, and I thought it would be okay to sneak this in now because it fits so perfectly with what you were talking about, and that was regarding stakeholders and the consultations with some of these stakeholders, what role do Indigenous people play in that? Are they contacted? Are they?
Absolutely. Yes.
Is it considered as? Are they considered as part of the overall community, or are they kind of segregated into a separate area of consideration of stakeholders? How does that work in ensuring that they're part of that process?
Absolutely, and that was a great question. Within the EIA itself, the process, we often find that the Indigenous communities are consulted with directly, and that traditional knowledge is brought into that EIA process. As far as within our project, we did, and especially in the areas where Indigenous communities, for example, in Alaska with the Native corporations, we made sure that we did visit them as well in terms of gathering that knowledge. Great question.
No, it's something that's been coming up more and more often in our discussions here, and it's really interesting because it changes, I think, in a lot of ways, the approach that a lot of people are taking toward the Arctic, and I think it's an improvement, to say the least. So that's quite exciting. Well, thank you very much. I do want to move quickly into, not quickly, but directly into Pamela's presentation, if possible. Pamela, are you ready to go? I'll show up here again.
Okay, sorry. I had a hard time.
No, not at all. Okay, so now we've got your audio working. I'm going to turn you into the presenter so that we can see your screen and your presentation. All right?
Sounds good. So hello, everyone. And thank you, Brendan, and thank you to Max for the invitation. And great presentation, Sonja. It's kind of fun to hear about the project again. So my focus is a little bit different. I'm actually going to build on what Sonja has been saying, but also kind of throw in one project that is quite relevant. So as background to myself, I actually was with Ecologic in Washington before moving to the Arctic Center. And my Arctic focus really just started 3.5 years ago at this point. So this is just the order. So first I was going to mention an Arctic Council project that just kicked off and focuses on EIA actually. Then I'll talk a little bit about the book that is based on the project Sonja was just mentioning. And then I will also look at two systems as Sonja did, but two different ones. So Finland and Canada, to look at their legislation and some examples of best practices as well. This Arctic Council project was just approved, I think, in May. And so in May, Finland took over the chairmanship of the Arctic Council for 2 years. The title of the project it's a little cumbersome, but it's at the top, Good Practice Recommendations for EIA and Public Participation in the Arctic. It's sponsored by the Ministry of Environment. And I've listed the goals. They're not that clear, but the question that was just raised about Indigenous communities and public participation, I think, goes to the heart of this, because public participation is a huge issue in EIA, is growing more and more as social impacts become more important, and the Indigenous participation now comes not only from local regulatory processes such as EIA, but from international law with the UN DRIP, the UN Development, I think, is a Treaty on Human Rights, but the notion of FPIC of that you need to consult Indigenous communities before you can actually go ahead with the project, and you need their consent. So this is the cover of the book, and the book is based on the Tekes project, but instead of just focusing on companies in the private sector, we wanted to broaden out to all stakeholders and find out what their opinions are on their EIA processes. Now in the book we were debating on how do we organize this, and so what we decided to do is look at the national EIA systems for all countries. But there's some exceptions because it's not as if every country just has a national EIA system, although all of them do. So in Norway, there is EIA legislation, but it's an appendix to the Planning and Building Act, and Norway prides itself on having a very integrated process. Greenland, there is a national EIA process, but it's rarely used. Maybe it's only been used for 1 or 2 projects at the most. Most EIAs have to deal with mining, but offshore oil and gas, although that's wound down considerably in the last 2 years. Canada is tricky. Canada has federal, Canada has 3 provinces, and 10 provinces and 3 northern territories, all of which have their own EIA systems. And if you are interested in Indigenous issues, I think Northern Canada is very, very interesting to look at because it is the Indigenous groups themselves who designed and oversee, and in some cases prepare the EIAs, but they oversee the whole process. Then we went through, stages in the EIA process, and we put together a flow chart, and then we wanted to ask some questions, like how do you compare and contrast the different systems, basically, and then to come up with some best practices. So the methodology we came up with our own definition of best practice, which I will get to, and the way we measured this, the way we determine what a best practice is to look at the 1997 Arctic EIA guidelines, and I will talk about that in a little bit because it ties directly to the Arctic Council project that is ongoing now. Now here's our definition of good practice. So it's quite vague, it allows for a lot of things, but it fits well. So best, good, smart practices all have the same meaning. Ways of implementing EIA in an ideal manner, which always exceeds the minimum level of what the law requires in a situation where many options are possible. And we felt it was important to include all of these words, basically, because there's a lot of antagonism toward the idea of a best practice. You can never have a large enough sample to actually have a best practice. And we didn't want to tie ourselves down too much, even though we did use the 1997 guidelines as a measure. So here, just a quick background. So in 1994, Finland initiated Arctic EIA guidelines under what was then the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy, the predecessor to the Arctic Council. This was a big deal, actually, because they had government-sanctioned experts at all of the meetings, and these people came up with best practice recommendations for how you implement EIA in the Arctic regions of these countries, not just these countries, but specifically the Arctic region. And then, of course, they had to define what is Arctic, what are the defining characteristics of the Arctic. And the reason why these are so important is because, to date, they are the only officially sanctioned guidelines on Arctic EIA, because they were approved once the Arctic Council became the Arctic Council in 1997. All of the ministers approved these guidelines. So they're important. And when we went around looking for best practice examples, so many people said they are still referred to. They're very relevant even today. Now, I was just mentioning what makes the Arctic the Arctic. And I think anyone who works on the Arctic bristles at the idea that it's actually a homogeneous region. Of course it's not. It's extremely different. But there are some characteristics that tend to be across the entire Arctic. And of course, the Arctic is warming twice as fast as any other place on Earth, so the impacts of climate change are huge. Indigenous populations in the EU, the Sami are the only indigenous peoples, not to mention, of course, Greenland, Canada, and the others. Everyone knows of the idea of incorporating traditional ecological knowledge, but because of the strength of the indigenous peoples in the Arctic, this becomes much more important. And there's a big debate now whether tech is really, whether it should be fit into an existing Western framework. And I think there's a lot of antipathy, actually, at this point towards TEK. The problem is there's no alternative. And here I mentioned land ownership because in Canada, the land claim settlement determines so much of how projects are proposed and carried out, and therefore how EIA is practiced. Infrastructure, of course, especially due to permafrost and the melting permafrost, infrastructure is a huge issue in the Arctic. Ecosystems are fragile, have longer recovery times, and Sonja mentioned, ecotourism, and most of the tourism in the Arctic is nature-based. So now we're going to move from the general to the specific, and this is a picture of Lapland, of northern Finland, and Rovaniemi is where I'm located. Let's see, and so if we move on to Finland, they have two pieces of legislation that involve EIA directly. The first is the EIA Act, and that defines those are the thresholds of what projects have to go through the EIA process. Then there's the EIA Decree, which actually talks about, well, how do you practice EIA? How do you do it? The EIA process is fairly similar to most of the others. There's a pre-screening and a screening process. What's actually, it's changed slightly because the new EU EIA directive has come into being. It had to be transposed. And in the course of that, Finland decided to add on another step. And that is where, even before pre-screening, companies can come into the regional center who oversees the EIA process and can talk about the project design and negotiate changes and all of that. That actually is not so popular because people feel that should be an open process, that it shouldn't just be between the company and the regulatory authority. There are some distinctive features in Finland's process, and in a country where a command and control system has been, in effect really since Finland came into being, the private sector now is becoming stronger and stronger. Not Finnish companies, but foreign companies, Canadian in particular. And we're finding that it is these foreign companies who are more proactive in pushing better practices. They come up with, they have the money and the capacity to develop models, to develop better technologies, to have better outreach to communities. So that's been an interesting finding. And perhaps the biggest criticism is that Finland they do not have an integrated process of EIA and permitting. They're sequential. So you have redundant hearings and people have no idea which hearing they're in. This is the flowchart we put together of Finland's system. And this just summarizes Finland's, basically where we found the best practices. And even though we interviewed engineers, we interviewed technical people involved in the environmental side of EIA, the best practices overwhelmingly focused on the social, focused on social impacts. So actually developing tools was one thing that was mentioned over and over, not just by companies, but by every stakeholder, because there is nothing right now to track, for example, mitigation measures over time. There is no comprehensive stakeholder mapping process. If you look down this idea of personal contact with stakeholders, probably the most important good practice we have found anywhere is that a company assigns at least one person, but specific people, to interact with the community. So the community can call these people directly anytime, any day, and they know who they are talking to. A personal relationship develops. In the Arctic, where population is sparse, distances are large, personal connections are key. Moving to Canada. Canada is complicated. Again, here are 10 provinces and the 3 northern territories. We looked at the province of Alberta because of tar sands. That was interesting in terms of EIA. And in the book, we looked at the Yukon and Northwest Territories and Nunavut. And here's a map of Canada. And so you can see Alberta in this moss green color. And then the 3 northern territories make up a large geographic portion of Canada. And Canada, again, has a federal layer. The provincial layer is similar to the federal layer. There's nothing that interesting in the basic EIA legislation. But what is interesting in Alberta is that 95% of the projects have to deal with tar sands, with oil sands. And they're in situ projects. They're small. So they don't necessarily need to go through EIA. But cumulatively, this is a big problem. Now, the Yukon Territory is interesting because it's the indigenous communities, the First Nations, who have come up with the process themselves, who oversee the process, and who write the EIAs. Again, social issues are key, traditional knowledge, and then combining traditional knowledge with Western science, extremely important. Here's the flowchart of Yukon. And then just looking at some best practices, focusing on the social again, some developers paid the stakeholders to hire technical experts to explain EIAs. They fly people to meetings. They flew elders up to the site to gather traditional knowledge. And the Yukon, actually similar findings here of what constitutes good practices. And these are the basic findings. Companies are more innovative than government, social issues are more important than environmental, and this idea of private governance. The companies are assuming government functions. Now, when we compare them with the 1997 Arctic EIA guidelines, I think it's interesting to see where companies did well. Stakeholder engagement, trust building, etc. Needing improvement, this was across the board. People wanted thresholds, alternatives were terrible. Cumulative impact analyses tended to be pretty bad. Baseline information in the north is very scarce. It's not good, especially when you compare it to the southern portions of these countries. Climate change has not been discussed in the 1997 guidelines, the role of companies, and then there's new terminology that keeps popping up, such as social license to operate, or what Sonja mentioned before, corporate social responsibility, this idea of impact and benefit agreements. So there are new issues to work on, that is for sure. And that is it for me.
Very good. Thank you so much, Pamela. Yeah, I think now would be a good opportunity to start opening it up for questions for all of the participants in general. I know we've got a couple already. I'm going to go ahead and pop my face up now so that we have there. So now that we have there, hello, there I am. And Pamela and Sonja, I'd invite both of you, if you would like to also open up your cameras so that the attendees can talk to people. Yeah, but not required, of course, but just in case that's an option. There's Pamela.
It's vacation time. My son's here. Sorry.
Wonderful. There's Dr. Bickford. Hello, Sonja. So I know, Brittany, you had a question that came up toward the end of, or before Pamela started. It's kind of a piggyback off of David's question, and I have it here, but I want to give you the opportunity to go ahead and ask it yourself. I've unmuted you, Brittany, if you want to go ahead and ask your question of Sonja.
Great, thanks, Brennan. So I guess I can pose this to both of you since you touched on the traditional indigenous knowledge. I know it's something that when you go to conferences, you hear a lot of criticism about how it's incorporated into the process. And it seems that, you know, having public meetings is one mechanism, but then how that actually gets translated into the documentation of environmental consequences seems to be where there's somewhat of a breakdown. So how it's incorporated into the evaluation process. Did you guys have any examples aside from the public meetings of effective incorporation of traditional indigenous knowledge, or do you think that there's still kind of a gap that needs to be bridged between TEK and kind of the scientific aspect of the assessments that happen?
Sonja, do you want to tackle that one first?
I'll turn my camera off.
Oh, you're fine. I'd be happy to. Yes, I hear the same thing, and I think it is a continuing maybe issue or topic to find a method that works, but not all, only in one region, but then all, and maybe that's something similar or different because the cultures and countries, the processes do differ somewhat as well. There are examples of ways to collect and work together with indigenous populations. Some examples we're providing because of a language barrier. For example, video simulations, or even simply tossing a map up on the wall and saying, here's markers, let's look at areas together. But then how do we translate that into the application or EIA documentation? That's another issue.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Lisa, I know you have a question, and you mentioned you may have to leave us a little bit early, so I want to make sure we get to you. I'm going to unmute you. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question? I believe it was meant for Pamela, but go ahead.
First of all, thank you. I'm sorry if I have to leave because they were two extremely great presentation. It's very, very interesting to hear about this concept of best practice. More specifically, I attended an online class about climate policy, and we deal with a lot about adaptation as a potential way of describing a policy in the Arctic. But now that I hear about the best practice, I'm not sure that I can connect the two concepts in the sense that can adaptation be an effective best practice, even if we consider all the indigenous people needs, or in the Canadian case, the massive territory Canada has, or the great amount of issues indigenous people have in that specific case?
Hi, thank you. Interesting question. Yes, I think, so when I think of adaptation, it is about specific measures that help people adjust to changing circumstances caused by climate. And so within that, there are many practices of adaptation that can be considered good practices. Norway is great with this, and it's incorporated a lot of it actually into their building code about how far you have to set back a building, that it has to be built something like 4 meters off the ground. So there are adaptation measures, absolutely, that can be considered good practice. And then I think there are adaptation measures that are nominal, that really are not considered good practice, but people are learning because it's happening so rapidly and technologies are changing so rapidly that the adaptation has to as well, and I'm not sure it's caught up with the rest of the things. I'm trying to think of some adaptation measures that are not good practices, and it's not coming to mind right now. So that would be my answer, is that there are specific adaptation measures that can be considered good practices. And I hope I answered your question. Maybe I was not understanding. Or does that answer your question?
Let's see. Lisa, was that,
okay,
did
thank
that
you.
answer your question pretty well, or?
It answered, and not only, it fostered a very good hope for a future and sustainable future. I don't know, but if you don't think about if you can't think about not best practice adaptation policy, that's actually good. Am I wrong?
I agree, absolutely. And okay, I shouldn't be moving off of the Arctic, but I am, because if you're interested in best practices in adaptation policy, or just adaptation policy to climate change, the Netherlands is second to none. I mean, and everything's on their website. It's terrific. So if you're just interested in that subject, not regionally specific, look at the Netherlands website. It's very interesting.
Well, that's a good tip. I like that. It's very interesting. Sonja, did you have anything to add to that, or are we ready for the next question?
No, yeah, not anything specifically. I thought that was a great answer.
Okay, very good. Bernd, I know you have a question. You're talking a little bit also along the lines of indigenous people in Alaska. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you if you want to introduce your topic or ask a specific question of either one of our panelists.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, thank you for taking my question. So in short, what I've been doing the last year since last September is working with the Marine Conservation Institute in their Washington, D.C. office on a project focused on creating a national marine sanctuary around the Pribilof Island of St. George in the Bering Sea. And as is typical of Alaska issues, one of the challenges is the engagement of indigenous peoples, the Aleut people in particular. And though I'm by no means an expert in that part of the world, despite what I've studied, one of the conclusions I've drawn is that one of the challenges is how do you effectively engage the indigenous peoples and respect their traditional knowledge and way of life. And if you look at the proposal document they submitted to NOAA, one of the arguments they make for creating a sanctuary is that it would protect their cultural heritage and way of life. But basically inspiring trust in the local people that they will be heard and their needs met is a challenge. So I'm trying to better understand how we can engage with that community. So.
Okay. Sonja or Pamela, either one of you want to take the bait, try to address that?
Pamela, you can maybe add to it as well. In terms of Alaska, and what we found is actually one of two things. Not only in the thing that Pamela was mentioning in her talk in terms of the meeting fatigue, depending on areas, but also the other in terms of indigenous populations. And you mentioned the trust factor. And what we found in our benchmarking as well, it takes time to establish the relationships, get the meetings, which was one of the reasons we went back a second time, because it takes time. And that's what, in terms of the interviews that came up as well, is many have said, well, we've sent representatives up to live in the community, to spend time getting to know the local population, the issues, things that are talked about on a daily basis. And it's a slower process, but it's one that I think tends to work, especially in the indigenous communities where communication and interaction is based on that face-to-face communication and interaction.
I guess one other thing to add, we interviewed someone from the, I guess it's the Bureau of Ocean and Energy Management. I'm a dinosaur, so it was MMS when I knew it. But they've done a lot of work, amazingly, on tribal cultures here. So I'm looking at this guidance document for characterizing tribal cultural landscapes. But they have, I think, in the last 2 years, spoken to all of the indigenous communities many, many times and worked with them in designing guidelines on how to incorporate them into these regulatory processes. So I'm not sure if it's online yet, but that might be interesting because it was the Alaska office who did that. So that would be really pertinent for you.
Oh, that's great.
If I find it, I can send the link.
Okay, that would be wonderful. I'd appreciate that. We could then spread it around to all of the participants. No, it's a very fascinating conversation. I think that it's one that's developing more and more, and this is one of the reasons why the Arctic, the diversity of the Arctic becomes such a valuable tool or a resource in a sense, because experiences in Canada, in Alaska, in Finland can then be shared to help understand what is working and what isn't as well. Some of these areas, they share some of the same barriers, but also they can learn from each other in such an interesting way. Brittany, you have another question, and I would certainly like for that to come out. This is interesting, and I think it would be best if you go ahead and ask it. Let me unmute you so that you can go ahead. Are you ready?
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Okay.
So this is not specific to climate adaptation, but rather the broader process of adaptive management and how that gets incorporated into specific projects. In the U.S., in our NEPA analyses, or EIA analyses, it's often very very well described, if you will, but then the translation into implementation is where things start to fall down a little bit. In particular, because it's not often well documented or well incorporated into the kind of project implementation the specific funds or resources for actually doing that adaptive management process over the lifetime of a project. And that really requires kind of a vision that I think tends to stop after the document is developed. And so I was wondering if there are other countries maybe that have done a good job, or companies that have done a really good job in kind of including that forethought into their planning process all the way through the implementation, and actually setting aside those specific resources to ensure that the adaptive process actually happens.
Okay. Who wants to take that question on?
I can take it.
Okay, great.
Good question, and difficult question. It's not quite my area, but I'll give it a shot. To my knowledge, in the Arctic, Canada has done the most work. And I think there are guidelines that have just come out from British Columbia about, not Arctic, but Canada, how to incorporate climate change, and there was a special focus on public engagement. But Canada, I know all of the provinces and the territories and the federal government as well has done a lot of work. And actually, now that I think about it, in 2012, the federal legislation had changed, basically gutted the existing environmental legislation. And now with the new government, with Trudeau, that's been overturned. And so they're revising their environmental legislation, and a big, big focus on climate change. So they keep pushing it. And I think also one interesting way of dealing with adaptive management throughout the entire life cycle are these impact and benefit agreements that Indigenous peoples negotiate with companies, because those are contracts that can be defended in court, and they have measures that ensure those adaptive management conditions are carried through. So it's one mechanism to actually ensure they're carried through the life of the project. And that's really kind of what I know in that area.
Okay. Sonja, I wanted to ask you, kind of along these guidelines, this idea, sometimes we hear, I know in the United States, in a very different area, we talk about companies moving around looking for tax breaks, tax deals in different states or countries nowadays. Do you find that similarly happening, within the Arctic region, where companies are maybe regulation shopping, looking for places to conduct business where they think they might have an easier time?
In our research, we had not heard that, but you do see companies going after the resources, the natural resources, and the opportunities that way, whether there's interest in. At the time the project was ongoing, the interest was in northwestern Russia in terms of building, but then you hear the exploration into Greenland, for example, and then looking at, in Iceland, on the other hand, is trying to attract more business. Not only tourism was huge, but then the other industries as well, to add to their variety, because right now it's just aluminum smelters and the energy production. And so looking as far as regulation shopping, I'm not sure. I haven't heard that.
Okay, okay.
Can I insert a cynical comment?
Of course.
Sorry. At the end of the day, I think what really matters to companies is commodity prices, is the return on their investment. If they're going to make money in a project, it would be great if the regulations weren't so onerous, but that never stops them.
Okay. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Okay, wait. Did you have something to say, Sonja? I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying, yeah. Good point. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, now we have another question, and I apologize if I don't pronounce your name correctly. Indrajit, I believe this is your first time with us. I think you missed the first couple of sessions, so I'm glad we have an opportunity to hear you and share your question. I'm going to go ahead and unmute you now if you're ready to go ahead and ask.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. You got my name right.
Okay.
So, thank you for the excellent presentations. I'm sorry I missed the earlier two webinars because I was traveling for work. So, my question is around the private sector, and if I heard it correctly, I heard that the private sector is doing well in terms of responding to the needs or meeting some of the standards which make it the best practice. So now, and I'm from Delhi in India, and we have several hydropower projects going on in neighboring states where EIAs are a big scam, and the private sector's companies are just invested in their own vested interests. So what is the motivation for the private sector to really go after or to do something well or well-meaning in that sense? And so I wanted to get a sense of of why or how is the private, or what motivates the private sector really there.
Okay.
In terms of I can go ahead. In terms of the motivations from the private sector, yes, not only the return on the investment with a cost-benefit issue, but also reputation and branding. And as Pamela was talking about, the social license to operate, which isn't necessarily a piece of paper, it is that positive impact or the corporate citizen of that community so that they're accepted and they can freely then operate in that community with the permission of the community as they see that company or organization being beneficial. So that drives some of the motivation because it's the public relations, the press around what is this mine or what is the oil and gas or whatever developer doing, not only to the environment, but also the local population.
I think it's interesting you mentioned there were hydropower dams, if I heard correctly. Sorry, my dog. Because I was thinking some of the other added incentives, if you need financing from the World Bank or the International Financial Corporation, they have, of course, standards that companies have to follow to get funding. So I'm assuming these companies would need to follow those, but maybe they're not getting funding from those sources. Then there are other things like this free, prior, and informed consent that come out of the UN treaty. There's international law now that at least is meant to ensure people's, but in this case, indigenous people's rights are protected. And the Ruggie Commission just came out with the guidelines for businesses and how they need to ensure everyone's human rights, not just indigenous peoples. So, there are also layers above the local level that should kick in to hopefully at least even maybe give communities or give municipalities tools to be able to somehow harness those companies.
No, I think you bring up a really good point there, Pamela, especially with the outside funding or finding investors, like with the World Bank. It's another area I do some research in sustainable finance, and the idea, with these different metrics that are being developed, both at the UN but also on Wall Street, and they're kind of coordinating some of their work for these socially responsible investing or impact investing, trying to come up with ways to give investors a warm, fuzzy feeling, with what's happening with their money, which and it becomes complicated. How exactly do you prove these things? There's a famous case about a state-owned petroleum company in Thailand that put out a green bond to explore the idea of doing biomass, but it really was just a way to subsidize their oil production. So it becomes it's difficult to regulate these, but at the same time there are a lot of arms out there. There are a lot of people out there trying to develop some tools, and I think in the case of like these hydropower plants in India or projects in the Arctic, you want to keep as many options open as possible for scaling up if that becomes an option, as well as maintaining that positive relationship, as you said, which is so important in these sparsely populated areas, because people don't forget, when you're in a tight community like that.
You're exactly right. Especially, it was interesting in Lapland. We found that it's been a county of out-migration basically since the 1960s. And so there are a lot of people who no longer live in Lapland, but they consider themselves Lappish. And they feel like they should have a voice in those projects. And so you mentioned social license. That's where that really kicks in. So you're right, when you talk about, well, who are the communities also, you know, who are authorized to give acceptance to a project? It's interesting. And yeah, what are their identities?
Well, that's something that in the United States, you know, we have the famous, the hyphenated identities, you know, the Irish American or whatever, and those of us who have ancestors from Ireland think that we belong, or we should almost be able to vote in their elections or something. You know, it's something that's common here, so we can certainly relate to that.
Wouldn't be bad to vote in elections now.
Okay, Lisa is still with us, which is great because she does have another question. So Lisa, I'll invite you to go ahead.
Oh, thank you. So I hear you talking in the last couple of questions, and so I thought about the Arctic Council and the fact that nowadays it's kind of turning into an international organization instead of an intergovernmental forum, more or less. Therefore, I'm thinking, if it becomes an intergovernmental organization, can we consider it as a point of meeting for the private sector, and then therefore this greater expertise, and eventually governments and therefore state policies?
Sonja, do you want to take that one?
One may be better for Pamela, especially with the Arctic Council project.
Yeah, yeah.
Sure. I think so. One, it's a really pertinent question, and actually they have been acting on it, because there's the Arctic Economic Council, which is not officially part of the Arctic Council, but it's meant to be affiliated with it, and that is just to focus on the private sector. So that's how the Arctic Council is now integrating the private sector. I'm sorry, can you repeat the last part of your question?
Okay, let me unmute her again so that she can, here we go.
Sorry.
Lisa, do you want to go ahead and say the second part of your question?
Yeah. No, it was just, can we consider it as a sort of integration of the governmental side and the economic side? Especially, I mean, I was thinking about the role today the indigenous people representation have in the Arctic Council as a forum, but I'm thinking about the Arctic Council as an organization. In this way, the three components, how will they interrelate in a potential integration of the three components?
I mean, I'm not an Arctic Council expert. There are people who do nothing but Arctic Council work, but you're right. So the indigenous peoples have the status of permanent participants, which is not exactly the same as a country status, but almost. And they can participate pretty much in any forum that there is. I don't quite know the details about the voting and how weighted that is, but indigenous peoples and the governments are well integrated. This began from when the Arctic Council commenced after AEPS. So I think that's integrated. I think the challenge is integrating the private sector, and the Arctic Economic Council is the vehicle they've chosen now to try to integrate the private sector into the Arctic Council. So we'll see how that works. I've even noticed them, they're at a lot of conferences. It's interesting, they're kind of spreading out there.
That is interesting. Okay. Let's see here. What's it? So Indrajit did offer a bit of a response. He didn't mean to be too cynical about it, because he does recognize the presence of laws to regulate some of the projects, but at the same time he says that the implementation is sometimes separate from the laws. So he does recognize that. But David, I believe you have another question. Sorry, I spoke over you last time, just to get it in between the presentations. but I would like to invite you, and let me find you here, to go ahead and ask your question. If you're ready, David, you can go ahead.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. And just one little question. If you see possible that local indigenous communities or groups could be relocated or resettlement due to commercial interests or private interests. You see it possible? Could it be possible? And who, if so, who could take that decision?
Okay, that's certainly a controversial one. I don't know. Oof, what do you all think? Would that ever come would that even come up as a topic, relocation of an entire indigenous community?
I've not heard that. The only examples that come to mind is where development has occurred, especially in whether it's Sweden or northern Finland, where the Sami and the reindeer herders are, and how the cooperation between the reindeer herder area or grazing grounds and that development. For example, a gold mine in Finland allows the reindeer to freely walk around the mine area because that is an area that they had traditionally used. The other one, in terms of having to relocate a town, comes to mind from Sweden, where a mine is essentially sinking in a town and they are physically moving the town itself.
Yeah.
But those are the only instances where I've heard of having to change or adapt or work together in terms of being able to accommodate both.
Yeah, I know that's Kiruna in Sweden, isn't it? That they're moving. Yeah, Max, I know, went and visited there a couple of years ago and came back talking about it. It was astounding. I think that it becomes quite complicated when we're looking at entire communities. But
in terms of climate change, I mean, we see the Alaskan communities. There's a few there that are having to relocate because of loss of land.
Mm-hmm.
But those are the only ones I can come up with.
I think just one comment on that is that if you're talking about resettlement just because of pure economic interests, no, I can't imagine in any Arctic country that would come up now, because in in countries such as Canada, there is a long history of resettlement, and it is extremely, extremely unpopular as a topic. And the government is doing everything it can to pay them to make up for all of that. So the idea of resettling just for economic interests, no. If it's for things like Sonja was talking about, yes, absolutely. Then it's a health and safety issue, so that's different. But,
okay, yeah. I think, Bernd, you had something to say along this topic, so I'm going to unmute you. Did you want to go ahead and share?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I can jump in and just kind of reiterate what I wrote in the dialogue box. That's one of the issues facing the island of St. George is the population, to my knowledge, is about 80 to 100 people, and those are probably not even year-round residents. And because of the changes in the Bering Sea, in the ecosystems of the Bering Sea, and the lack of their success in creating sustainable fisheries, as a major economic activity, they're faced with the possible collapse of their community because of these issues. And for example, one of the things that the mayor told me not too long ago is that I think the primary school or the only school on the island is recently closing. And what that brings to mind is the issue of when a community starts to lose its fundamental institutions, when does it become an inevitable death spiral and the community just collapses because there's not sufficient resources and infrastructure there to attract people. So whereas whole nations aren't experiencing relocation, I think some of these island communities definitely face that throughout the world depending on the details of the realities.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. No, that is a really good point, and that is something that I think will that will actually become an issue, and that may become a major topic of consideration within the Arctic, with this idea of what do we do with these communities that were or that are currently in precarious geographic locations, and whose responsibility or whose role is it to see that they're relocated to a safe place. Let me see. We don't have any questions at the moment. Let me see if anybody's hand is raised. No, we don't have any raised hands. So at this point, I guess what I'd like to do is one last call for questions. If any of the participants has a question they want to ask or a topic they want to discuss, especially in this area of environmental impact assessments and best practices, both on the private and the public sector. And what I've really enjoyed about the conversation is this nexus between the two, among the two, how they come together. And while we see that, I want to ask our panelists, Sonja, is there anything you want to add, anything else you want to talk about or discuss, especially about current work that you're doing, or some of the any specific experiences or aspects to this research that come to mind?
The one example that came to mind off the last comment was actually where economic development is beneficial. There was a rural community in Arctic Sweden where they were essentially going to close up shop. Everybody had moved out. They had seen that there was nothing left. However, they were able to attract a larger industry into the town, which then attracted more people. They built up the infrastructure, and the town is up and running again. So that may be that opposite example of this is where economic development may be beneficial in that type of situation.
What was the industry? Do you remember, or do you know off the top of your head? Because I wonder then.
I want to say it was a mine, but I'm not 100% sure. I could look into the example, but that came up in one of our interviews of is there, what are the various examples? And that was one of them that, and it especially stuck in my mind as being that, hey, this is the positive side of trying to attract the right industry for the town that will support the community as well.
Yeah, no, that is really fascinating. Pamela, over to your side. Is there anything that during the course of this conversation has popped into your head, or anything about current research or work that you're doing that you wanted to mention today?
I know we had talked a little, and you suggested I mention this one project. Sorry, I'm not being very articulate. It's 7:30 in Brussels. Sorry. Well, okay. The one project I think that is interesting and based on these questions might be of interest to all of you is actually Horizon 2020. We just got funded, literally. And it's on putting together mining regions in the European Union. But this call originally were two separate calls. One was to develop kind of framework conditions for sustainable mining. One was on developing European Union social license to operate guidelines and a pan-European social license to operate toolbox. They combined those two calls. So now, we are going to work on this project. I'm leading the SLO work package, and I think it'll be very interesting, even though this is not Arctic focused. I think the idea of public engagement and how you ensure all stakeholders are heard, and going beyond that. And I think we've all gotten the idea that implementation, that it's one thing to come up with great plans and strategies, that's easy. But to actually implement it on the ground, that's tough. And that is part of what we're going to be trying to do too. So I'm hoping to further this implementation part of public engagement. So we'll see.
No, that's really interesting. That's one of the things I recently was doing a talk about public participation, specifically with large-scale urban redevelopment projects, but it really applies in just about every situation. And I think in the Arctic it becomes even more interesting because of the different communities who call the Arctic home now. But that is, you know, having a town hall meeting, you know, asking questions ahead of time, or, you know, asking people to choose between option A and B, these aren't sufficient anymore. And so I'll be really interested to see what you all come up with, but also just how the long-term, what the progress is in this area of public engagement and really getting people to participate, not only with interested stakeholders, with investors or with local governments or national governments, but also with their, you know, with their neighbors, you know, especially in urban settings. It's a big issue to get neighbors talking to each other just as much as talking to the government officials.
Sorry, I mean that is really interesting, and I think you've exactly hit what the focus is now, because the Commission keeps emphasizing end users. So when you think of stakeholders, you don't really think of end users as in those of us who use smartphones or who use computers. So basically end users are everybody, but it's how do you engage all of these people through the entire supply chain, through the entire process, you know, until the end user. And that is a challenge because it is not being done well anywhere, really.
No, and it's kind of what we're all supposed to be going for in democratic countries. You know, that's the idea, is that we're all part of the process. But that gets a little political, a little philosophical, I guess. I want to check one more time if nobody has put up any questions. I think that means we've come about to the end of our conversation for today. I want to thank both of you. Sonja, unless either of you has a last word that you want to put in?
No, thank you for today. This was a great opportunity. I enjoyed speaking with all of you.
No, thank you very much. It was really a fascinating conversation. I think it's something that's so difficult to talk about because it's always evolving and always changing, but that's what makes it so much fun. Because we can all enter the conversation at any point and still learn something and have something to say, I think, because that's part of the process. So Sonja, Dr. Bickford, thank you very much. Pamela, thank you for taking time during summer vacation.
Sorry.
No, I think it's wonderful. And we thank your son and your dog for being helpful and considerate. I'll let both of you go now. I would ask the attendees or the participants of the Arctic Summer College to stay online for a few more minutes so we can talk about some housekeeping stuff. But once again, thank you to both of you for being with us today, and have a great rest of your week.
Thank you. Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, well, for the rest of us, for the Arctic Summer College, I do want to say once again, as I've said a few times, I really like to focus on writing and trying to produce content. And one of the things that they've asked me to do, one of the reasons they brought me on to the team here, is to kind of work in some fashion to help you all with that aspect of academic and research writing. So I'd like to encourage you, all of you, to submit an abstract if you're interested in going to Iceland in October. And don't be afraid of it being perfect. I really am more interested in good ideas that have the potential to get developed, to be developed into something that fits well with the presentation. As I mentioned at the beginning, we are looking to do another yearbook, another book publication, probably with Springer in Germany, which would then be an invitation to just about everybody to submit an article. We have 12 chapters in the book coming out this year, So you would all be welcome to submit something. And that process is, it takes a little while. You know, we work with you on developing an idea. You know, we start basically with the abstract, and then we do a rough draft. Then you do kind of your final first draft, and then we have it peer reviewed. We have a large number of people, scientists working in the field, researchers, professors from all over the world, who can then help to review your papers, see what kind of sourcing or whatever else could be improved. And then we hopefully will publish it in the book. But if you prefer, we can also try to get it published in different journals or other academic publications. So there are lots of opportunities to get your writing out there. And as I also mentioned at the beginning, the blog, our website, we haven't done anything with it this year. So I was just looking at it and thought, we should. Why not? So anybody who's interested in writing a short blog, 400 to 600, 800 words maximum, it can be a general topic. It can be about what we're discussing in the Arctic Summer College. It's just a way to get you, one, a byline, which is always nice to have, but also to get you practicing writing about these things and getting that out there. So if any of you has any questions right now, I'm happy to answer them. You can just raise your hand or submit them through the chat function at the question section on your dashboard. We can deal with them. Otherwise, I just encourage you to send an email to the coordinator at Arctic Summer College, so we can review them and correspond that way. Let's see. All right. Well, since it doesn't look like anybody has any questions, I think we can slowly close for this week. Next week, we have another 2 presentations. I believe Max is back from Kazakhstan next Wednesday, so he'll be moderating the conversation. I'll be away again, but I think Arna might be back as well. So we'll just continue with the discussions. I don't remember, I think if we check it, let's see, their upcoming sessions. Who is it next week? Okay. Oh, this is actually quite fun. Alexander Shestakov will be talking about the long-term vision for the Arctic, which is a topic I really like. It's a topic that kind of informs the first chapter of the book that we're publishing this year, rethinking what the Arctic is, what it means in a global context. So Alexander will be there to talk, which is nice, and then also Piper Foster Wilder from Alaska. She'll be talking about funding and operating renewable diesel infrastructure in the Arctic and private sector opportunities. But Ben, I know that you're very interested in Alaska. I know many of you actually are very interested in Alaska. And that's where Piper is based, I believe. So she'll be a good person to ask about questions in that regard. So I guess that'll close us out for this week. I appreciate all of your attention and participation. The questions are wonderful. Our presenters always appreciate it to have such an active and engaged audience, and especially in a format like this, it's very validating for them when we know that these questions are popping up. So please continue to do that. And next week, I hope we have just as many questions and as engaged in discussion as we did this week. I'm really happy to hear so much interest about Indigenous peoples and how they can and should be a part of the conversation. If these are topics that you're interested in, I really do encourage those to inform any articles or anything that you'd like to write about as well. Again, with the blog posts, if you just want to do something that talks a little bit about the work that you're doing, an introduction to your own research, that you wouldn't mind being basically public, you know, highlighting your institute or your school or your company or organization, we'd be happy to put that up as well. So just let us know if you'd like any help, or if you have any questions about any of those things. Please do not forget to send your abstract in by the end of the day today, midnight Eastern time. So you have some time left. I will say goodbye then for this week. Thank you very much for participating, and we'll look forward to either chatting in the Facebook group, corresponding through email, or seeing you next week for the next session of the Arctic Summer College. Have a great week. Bye-bye.